On the morning of January 20th, 1953, Washington stood witness to one of the most uncomfortable moments in American political history. The temperature held steady at 49 degrees under overcast skies, but the real chill came from inside a black limousine parked outside the White House. President-elect Dwight David Eisenhower sat in that vehicle, arms crossed, jaw set, refusing absolutely to step foot inside the building where Harry S. Truman waited. This was no accident or misunderstanding. This was deliberate. Eisenhower had made his position clear to everyone around him. He would not enter the White House as a guest. He would not share coffee with the Trumans. He would not follow the traditions that had governed peaceful transitions of power since the founding of the Republic. Instead, he would sit in that car and force the sitting President of the United States to come outside and join him, like a servant summoned to the curb. Inside the White House, Harry Truman stood at a window, watching the car that refused to move. He understood exactly what was happening. This was a calculated insult, delivered on what should have been one of the most dignified days in American democracy. The man in the limousine was 62 years old and stood as perhaps the most respected military figure in the world. He had commanded the Allied forces in Europe during World War II, orchestrating the liberation of an entire continent from Nazi tyranny. The relationship between Truman and Eisenhower had not always been poisoned by bitterness and rage. There had been a time when these two men worked together with genuine respect and mutual admiration. Truman had called Eisenhower the greatest military mind of the age. Eisenhower had written to Truman with sincere gratitude for his support and leadership. They had met dozens of times for official business and ceremonies. They had coordinated on matters of national security and foreign policy. The photographs from those earlier years show two men who appeared comfortable in each other's presence, partners in the great work of securing American interests in a dangerous post-war world. But something had shattered that partnership beyond repair. Something had transformed mutual respect into something close to hatred. The break did not happen overnight or through a single incident. It happened slowly over months and years through a series of choices and betrayals and political calculations that neither man could forgive or forget. The fracture became visible to the entire nation on that cold January morning in 1953, but the damage had been building for years before. The first seeds of the eventual conflict were planted in July 1945 in Germany. President Truman, newly in office after Franklin Roosevelt's sudden death, met with General Eisenhower on the Autobahn outside Potsdam. Truman and Eisenhower drove together through the ruins of Berlin, past buildings reduced to rubble by years of bombing and street fighting. Truman looked at the younger general beside him and saw something he believed America desperately needed. He turned to Eisenhower and made an offer that was almost unbelievable in its generosity. He told the general that there was nothing Eisenhower might want that Truman would not try to help him get. That included the presidency itself in 1948. This was not casual conversation or empty flattery. Truman meant every word. He had been vice president for only 82 days when Roosevelt died on April 12, 1945. He inherited a war still raging on two fronts: secret atomic weapons research he knew nothing about, and relationships with Allied leaders he had never met. He felt overwhelmed and unprepared. He admired military leadership, and Eisenhower represented everything Americans wanted in a leader at that moment. Eisenhower thanked him politely, but firmly declined. He insisted he had no political ambitions whatsoever. He was a soldier and intended to remain a soldier for the rest of his working life. Truman accepted that answer without argument. In the years that followed, the two men worked together frequently. Truman appointed Eisenhower as Army Chief of Staff in November 1945. Over the following years, Truman awarded Eisenhower the Distinguished Service Medal on 3 separate occasions in 1945, 1948, and 1952, recognizing his continued service to the nation. When the North Atlantic Treaty Organization was created in 1949, as a defensive alliance against Soviet expansion. Truman knew exactly who should lead it. He called on Eisenhower to serve as NATO's first supreme commander in 1951, giving him responsibility for coordinating the military forces of multiple nations into a unified defensive structure. Eisenhower accepted and performed brilliantly, building relationships with European military and political leaders that would serve American interests for decades to come. Throughout this period, Truman and Eisenhower exchanged friendly letters and met regularly for official business and ceremonies. Their relationship was not intimate or deeply personal, but it was professional, respectful, and highly productive. Both men benefited from the arrangement. Then in 1947, something truly remarkable happened that revealed just how much Truman valued Eisenhower's leadership. Truman made the offer again, but this time he put it in writing in his private diary. On July 25, 1947, Truman wrote about a conversation he had with Eisenhower that afternoon. They discussed the possibility that Douglas MacArthur might return from Japan to seek the Republican presidential nomination. Truman's solution was characteristically bold and self-sacrificing. Truman proposed that if MacArthur ran as a Republican, Eisenhower should announce for the Democratic nomination instead. Truman wrote that he would gladly step aside and run as Eisenhower's vice president, demoting himself from the highest office in the land to second place. He added in his diary that he liked the Senate anyway, and that he and Eisenhower could be elected together easily. He wrote that his family and himself would be happy outside what he called the great white jail known as the White House. This was not fantasy or idle speculation on Truman's part. This was the sitting President of the United States genuinely offering to demote himself to Vice President in order to put Dwight Eisenhower in the White House. The offer revealed how little confidence Truman had in his own political future at that particular moment in 1947 when his approval ratings had collapsed. It also showed how much Truman valued Eisenhower's leadership, character, and potential for greatness. Eisenhower said no again, just as firmly as before. He still insisted he had no interest in politics at all. In 1948, Truman faced the worst political crisis of his presidency up to that point. His approval ratings had collapsed to terrible levels. The Democratic Party was splintering into hostile factions. Henry Wallace was running as a progressive candidate, pulling votes from the left wing. Strom Thurmond was running as a Dixiecrat, pulling Southern votes away with his segregationist platform. Republicans controlled both houses of Congress. Every political expert said Truman would lose in a crushing landslide to Republican nominee Thomas Dewey, but Truman refused to quit. He ran anyway against all predictions, against terrible poll numbers, against a divided Democratic Party. Against all expectations, Truman won. It was one of the greatest upsets in American political history. He won without Eisenhower's help or endorsement. He won on his own terms, through his own efforts. But Eisenhower's repeated refusals had planted something uncomfortable in Truman's mind. If Eisenhower truly had no interest in politics whatsoever, why did people keep approaching him to run? The question would be answered 4 years later in 1952 when Eisenhower made his shocking announcement. He would seek the Republican nomination for president after all. The announcement stunned many people across the country. But it shocked Harry Truman most of all. For 5 straight years, Eisenhower had insisted repeatedly that he had no interest in politics. He had refused multiple offers to run as a Democrat. He had turned down the extraordinary chance to become president without having to campaign for it. And now suddenly, Eisenhower was entering politics anyway, but as a Republican, running against the very party that had supported him throughout his entire career. Truman felt personally betrayed on a level that was both political and deeply emotional. He had offered Eisenhower the presidency twice with complete sincerity, and Eisenhower had said no both times, claiming he did not want political office at all. Now it turned out Eisenhower did want it. He just did not want it from Truman or from the Democrats. But even that political betrayal was not what broke the relationship beyond all possibility of repair. What Truman absolutely could not accept was what happened during the 1952 campaign involving George Catholic Marshall. Marshall had been born in Pennsylvania in 1880 and graduated from the Virginia Military Institute in 1901. When World War II began, Marshall was Army Chief of Staff, holding that position from 1939 to 1945. During those 6 critical years, George Marshall transformed the United States Army from a small force of fewer than 200,000 men into a military machine of over 8 million soldiers. He selected the commanders who would lead those forces. He approved the battle plans that would win the war. And most importantly for this story, he made Dwight Eisenhower's entire career possible. In 1941, Eisenhower was a lieutenant colonel unknown outside small military circles. Marshall saw something special in him. He promoted Eisenhower rapidly, jumping him over hundreds of more senior officers. By 1942, Eisenhower was commanding Allied forces in North Africa. By 1943, Marshall recommended Eisenhower to lead Operation Overlord, the D-Day invasion of France that would decide the fate of Europe. Marshall had desperately wanted that command for himself. It was the most important military operation of the war and possibly of the entire century. Every military officer dreamed of such a command. But President Roosevelt asked Marshall to stay in Washington to continue managing the global war effort. Marshall agreed without complaint and gave the command to Eisenhower instead. He could easily have resented Eisenhower for getting the glory while Marshall stayed behind doing staff work. But Marshall never showed the slightest bit of resentment. He supported Eisenhower completely. Winston Churchill called Marshall the organizer of victory. Historians credit Marshall with creating the military force that won World War II. After the war ended in 1945, Marshall tried to retire. But in 1947, President Truman asked him to serve as Secretary of State. Marshall agreed, despite his exhaustion. It was Marshall who articulated the principles of the European Recovery Program at Harvard University on June 5, 1947. The program became known as the Marshall Plan. Between 1948 and 1952, the United States provided over $13 billion to help rebuild Western European economies. In 1953, Marshall was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for this work, becoming the only career military officer ever to receive that extraordinary honor. After serving as Secretary of State, Marshall retired again. But in 1950, when the Korean War began, Truman called on him one more time. Marshall became Secretary of Defense from September 1950 to September 1951. So when Senator Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin began attacking Marshall in 1950 and 1951, he was attacking one of the principal architects of Allied victory in World War II, and he was attacking Dwight Eisenhower's mentor, patron, and friend, the man who had made everything possible. Marshall had promoted Eisenhower over hundreds of more senior officers. Marshall had recommended Eisenhower to lead the D-Day invasion. Marshall had made Eisenhower's career. Eisenhower owed Marshall absolutely everything. In 1950 and 1951, Senator Joseph McCarthy was riding high on anti-communist hysteria. He had made a career out of accusing people of being communist sympathizers, usually with no evidence whatsoever. McCarthy accused Marshall of being part of a vast communist conspiracy. In a speech on the Senate floor in June 1951, McCarthy spent 60,000 words attacking Marshall. He called Marshall's career a conspiracy so immense and an infamy so black as to dwarf any previous venture in the history of man. These accusations were completely insane and obviously false to anyone who knew anything about Marshall's actual record. Marshall had spent his entire adult life serving the United States. He had built the army that defeated Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. He had created the Marshall Plan that stopped communist expansion in Europe. The idea that Marshall was secretly working for the communists was grotesque and absurd. Truman was absolutely enraged by these attacks on Marshall. He called Marshall the greatest living American, and Truman fully expected Eisenhower to publicly defend Marshall against McCarthy's outrageous smears. If anyone should stand up for Marshall, it should be Eisenhower. In October 1952, during the presidential campaign, Eisenhower was scheduled to give a major speech in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, McCarthy's home state. McCarthy would be on the stage with Eisenhower. Eisenhower's campaign staff prepared a speech that included one paragraph explicitly defending Marshall. The paragraph was clear. It said Eisenhower had known Marshall for 35 years and knew him to be dedicated with singular selflessness and the profoundest patriotism to the service of America. The paragraph was included in the prepared text released to reporters in advance. Political observers expected Eisenhower to stand in McCarthy's home state and defend his mentor. It would be a powerful statement about character and loyalty. But then Wisconsin Governor Walter Kohler, Jr. and members of Eisenhower's campaign staff urgently urged him to remove the paragraph entirely. They argued it would unnecessarily offend McCarthy. It would offend Wisconsin Republicans. It would create pointless controversy. They insisted it was not worth the political cost. Wisconsin had valuable electoral votes that Eisenhower needed. McCarthy was genuinely popular there. Why pick a fight over something that would not change votes? Eisenhower listened to his advisers. He understood they were trying to help him win. And he desperately wanted to win because he believed he could do great things as president. He believed he could end the Korean War. He believed he could manage the Cold War better than Truman had. To do those things, he needed to win the election. To win the election, he needed Wisconsin. So Eisenhower agreed. He deleted the paragraph. He made the calculation that winning was more important than defending Marshall. On October 3, 1952, Dwight Eisenhower stood on a stage in the Milwaukee Arena in front of 10,000 people with Senator Joseph McCarthy standing beside him. Eisenhower delivered his speech. He praised McCarthy's anti-communist efforts. He talked about rooting out subversion. He said absolutely nothing about George Marshall. Not one word. He did not defend him. He did not mention him. After the speech concluded, McCarthy approached Eisenhower. The photographers were ready. McCarthy reached out his hand. Eisenhower tried to step back, tried to avoid the handshake, but there were people behind him blocking his path. McCarthy was too quick. He grabbed Eisenhower's hand and held it high in the air, like a referee raising the hand of a victorious boxer. The cameras flashed. A photograph went out across the country. Dwight Eisenhower, hero of D-Day, shaking hands with the man who had called his mentor a traitor. The news coverage was brutal. The paragraph defending Marshall had been in the advance text, so reporters knew Eisenhower had planned to defend Marshall and then chose not to. This was not an oversight. This was a deliberate choice. Eisenhower had weighed defending his mentor against winning Wisconsin, and Wisconsin had won. The New York Times ran a front-page story. The Washington Post published a scathing editorial. Columnists across the political spectrum condemned the decision. Even some Republicans were disgusted. One Republican editor wrote that Eisenhower had sold his soul for a mess of pottage. Truman's reaction was immediate and blunt. He told reporters he had never thought the man who is now the Republican candidate would stoop so low. He called it one of the most shocking things in the history of this country. Truman said the trouble with Eisenhower was that he was just a coward, and he ought to be ashamed for what he did. Truman did not stop there. He made defending Marshall a central theme of his campaign appearances. He reminded audiences that Marshall had been Eisenhower's boss, his mentor, the man who had made Eisenhower's career possible. He asked how anyone could trust Eisenhower to stand up to the Soviets if he could not even stand up to Joe McCarthy. He questioned Eisenhower's character, his judgment, his fitness for the presidency. Eisenhower knew what Truman was saying. He read the newspapers. He heard the criticism. And instead of accepting it as the price of his political choice, he became angry. He felt Truman's attacks were unfair, partisan, personal. He believed Truman was using Marshall as a political weapon. He convinced himself that Truman did not actually care about Marshall. But Truman did care about Marshall deeply. Marshall had been Truman's Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense. Marshall had been one of Truman's most trusted advisors. Truman genuinely called Marshall the greatest living American. For Truman, loyalty mattered. Character mattered. Standing up for the people who had stood up for you mattered. And Eisenhower had failed that test in the most public way possible. There was more to the story. 2 weeks before the Milwaukee speech, Eisenhower had campaigned in Indianapolis with Senator William Jenner. Jenner was the man who had called Marshall a frontman for traitors and accused him of joining hands with a criminal crowd of traitors and communist appeasers. Jenner represented everything ugly about the anti-communist hysteria, the willingness to destroy reputations, to make baseless accusations, to use fear as a weapon. Eisenhower knew what Jenner had said about Marshall. Everyone knew. But Eisenhower needed Indiana. Jenner was powerful in the state Republican Party. Eisenhower's advisors told him he had to appear with Jenner, had to accept his endorsement, had to stand on the same platform and smile. So Eisenhower did it. He appeared on stage with Jenner. He let Jenner embrace him. He smiled. The photographers captured the image. Eisenhower and Jenner, arms around each other, united against the Democrats. Eisenhower later told aides he felt dirty after the event, but he did it anyway. He told himself it was necessary. He told himself he could wash off the stain after the election. He told himself that winning justified these compromises. But for Truman, this was worse than Milwaukee. At least in Milwaukee, Eisenhower had originally planned to defend Marshall and then backed down. In Indianapolis, Eisenhower never even tried. To Truman, this pattern revealed something fundamental about Eisenhower's character. Eisenhower was willing to stand with men who slandered George Marshall because it was politically convenient. Eisenhower would sacrifice principle for votes. He would abandon loyalty for electoral advantage. He would compromise his stated values if it helped him win. And if Eisenhower would do that to George Marshall, what would he do as president? If he could not stand up to McCarthy and Jenner during a campaign, how could he stand up to the Soviets in the White House? If political pressure could make him abandon his mentor, what else would political pressure make him abandon? These were the questions Truman asked in his campaign speeches. These were the doubts he tried to plant in voters' minds. He made the campaign personal, because for him, it was personal. This was not just about policy differences. This was about character. This was about whether Dwight Eisenhower was the man Truman had once believed him to be. The campaign got worse from there. Eisenhower pledged to go to Korea if elected, implying he could end the war Truman had been unable to finish. Truman called this demagoguery. Republican surrogates attacked Truman's administration as soft on communism and corrupt. Truman responded by calling Eisenhower a stooge for Wall Street. By Election Day, the personal animosity between the two men was impossible to hide. Eisenhower won in a landslide. He took 55% of the popular vote. He won 442 electoral votes to Adlai Stevenson's 89. He even broke the Democratic hold on parts of the South. After the election, Eisenhower and Truman met once on November 18, 1952, for a transition briefing at the White House. Both men approached the meeting with dread. They had spent the previous 3 months attacking each other. They had said things that could not be unsaid. The meeting was held in the Oval Office. Truman sat behind the resolute desk. Eisenhower sat across from him. The atmosphere was stiff, formal, and uncomfortable. Neither man wanted to be there. Truman tried to brief Eisenhower on how the White House actually worked. He explained the staff structure, the decision-making process, the the way cabinet meetings were conducted. He tried to share practical wisdom earned through nearly 8 years in office. Eisenhower listened with visible impatience. He had been a 5-star general. He had commanded millions of men. He did not need Harry Truman to tell him how to run an organization. Eisenhower later wrote that the meeting added little to his knowledge and did not affect his planning. He felt Truman had wasted his time. Truman felt the meeting was a waste of time for different reasons. Eisenhower was not listening. Everything Truman said went in one ear and out the other. Between the election and the inauguration, Eisenhower made decisions that seemed designed to irritate Truman. He decided to wear a Homburg hat to the inauguration instead of the traditional silk top hat. He did not consult Truman. It was a small thing, but it felt like a deliberate break from tradition. By Inauguration Day, the tension between the two men was visible to everyone. Clark Clifford, a White House advisor, said the hatred between the two men that day was like a monsoon. Eisenhower told associates he was not sure if he could stand sitting next to that guy for the ride to the Capitol. He resented having to share a car with Truman, resented having to pretend they were friendly. And so Eisenhower made his decision. He would not enter the White House. He would not have coffee with Harry and Bess Truman. He would not follow tradition. He would stay in the limousine and make Truman come to him. Mamie Eisenhower sat beside her husband in the car. She knew what he was doing. She said nothing. Inside the White House, Truman knew what was happening. He saw the car sitting outside. He knew Eisenhower was not coming. For a moment, it seemed like Truman might refuse to go outside. It seemed like the inauguration might not happen because two stubborn men could not agree on who would walk through a door first. But Truman was still the president. He had a responsibility to the country and to the office. He swallowed his anger and walked outside. The photographers captured the moment. Truman emerged from the north portico. He walked to the car. Eisenhower did not get out. Truman opened the door and climbed into the back seat. The two men sat beside each other. They did not look at each other. They did not speak. The car began the drive to the Capitol. The silence in the car was heavy and suffocating. Both men stared straight ahead. Mamie Eisenhower tried to make small talk. She commented on the weather. She mentioned the crowds. But neither man responded. Bess Truman was not in the car because she had gone ahead earlier. At some point during the drive, Eisenhower broke the silence. He asked Truman, who had ordered his son John back from Korea for the inauguration. John Eisenhower was 29 years old, a major in the Army, serving with combat units in Korea. The war was still being fought. American soldiers were dying. Someone had issued orders pulling John out of Korea and sending him back to Washington. Eisenhower wanted to know who had made that decision. Truman looked at Eisenhower and said simply, "I did." He explained that the president thought it was right and proper for Eisenhower's son to witness his father's swearing in. It was a generous gesture. Truman understood what the moment meant, a father becoming president while his son served in a war zone. Truman had used his authority as commander-in-chief to make sure John Eisenhower could be there to see his father take the oath of office. Truman did not ask for credit. He did not announce it publicly. He just did it because he thought it was right. Because despite his anger at Eisenhower, despite the bitterness of the campaign, despite everything that had gone wrong between them, Truman still believed some things mattered more than politics. Family mattered. Historic moments mattered. Doing the decent thing mattered. Eisenhower said nothing in response. No thank you. No acknowledgement of the gesture. No recognition of what Truman had done. He just turned back to looking out the window, watching the crowds lining Pennsylvania Avenue. Years later, Eisenhower did thank Truman in a letter several days after the inauguration. But in the moment, sitting beside Truman in that car, Eisenhower said nothing. They arrived at the Capitol. The ceremony began. Chief Justice Fred Vinson administered the oath of office. Eisenhower became the 34th President of the United States. He delivered his inaugural address. He spoke about America's responsibility to lead the free world. Truman stood nearby and listened. When the ceremony ended, he left immediately. He did not attend the inaugural parade. He did not watch Eisenhower settle into the White House. He went to Union Station, where at least 5,000 people had gathered to see him off. They cheered for him. They shouted his name. Harry Truman boarded the train to Independence, Missouri. He left Washington after nearly 8 years as president. He would not return to the White House for 10 years. Eisenhower moved into the White House and began his presidency. He did not invite Truman back. Not for state dinners, not for ceremonies, not for anything. For 8 years, from 1953 to 1961, Truman never set foot in the White House. Eisenhower sent 3 invitations during that time. The first was in 1953 for a routine event. Truman declined. The second was in 1959 for a dinner honoring Winston Churchill. Truman declined again. The third invitation was also declined. Truman felt the invitations were insincere, empty gestures. Eisenhower felt Truman was being petty. The two men lived in a state of frozen hostility. They did not speak. They did not correspond. Truman later said he could hardly mention Eisenhower's name without using profanity. Then, in October 1959, something happened that forced them to be in the same room. George Marshall died. Marshall passed away at Walter Reed Hospital on October 16, 1959. His funeral was held on October 20th at the Fort Myer Chapel in Virginia. President Eisenhower attended. Former President Truman attended. They sat in the same pew side by side for the first time since Inauguration Day 1953. It had been 6 years and 9 months since they had been in the same room. Neither man spoke to the other during the service. They sat in silence, mourning the man who had meant so much to both of them. Marshall, the organizer of victory, the man whose career had made both of their careers possible. After the service, they went their separate ways. No handshake, no words, just the shared presence at a funeral. Over the next 4 years, Truman and Eisenhower saw each other occasionally at other funerals. Each time they maintained their distance. They were civil but cold. They acknowledged each other's presence, but did not engage. Then in November 1963, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. The nation went into mourning. Former Presidents Truman and Eisenhower both came to Washington for the funeral. On November 25, 1963, the funeral procession moved from the Capitol to Arlington National Cemetery. Truman and Eisenhower rode in the same car to the cemetery. Margaret Truman and Mamie Eisenhower rode with them. During the drive, they talked. They discussed whether Kennedy's assassination was a conspiracy or a lone gunman. They talked about the state of the world, about the challenges facing the country. After the graveside service, Margaret Truman invited the Eisenhowers to join her father for lunch at Blair House. The Eisenhowers accepted. Sandwiches were served. Coffee was poured. For an hour, Harry Truman and Dwight Eisenhower sat together and talked. They reminisced about old battles, political and otherwise. They talked like two old men who had once known each other well and were remembering what that had felt like. When it was time for Eisenhower to leave, Truman and Margaret walked the Eisenhowers to their car. The two former presidents stood on the sidewalk and talked for a few more minutes. Then they shook hands. It was a long, lingering, silent handshake. Margaret kissed Eisenhower on the cheek. Mamie kissed Truman. 10 years after that cold January morning, in 1953, they had finally found their way back to something resembling friendship. They met one more time in Kansas City in 1966. Eisenhower's brother Milton observed that all the old animosities were forgotten, and they had quite a good time together. Dwight David Eisenhower died on March 28, 1969, at the age of 78. Harry S. Truman died on December 26, 1972, at the age of 88. The story of what happened on January 20th, 1953, became part of American political lore. The image of Eisenhower refusing to enter the White House became a symbol of how personal grievances can poison public duty.